Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Holden Hellmann, MBA candidate in 2026. Today, we will be examining mediation as a strategic alternative dispute resolution process by modern businesses. But before we get talking about mediation, or that whole mouthful of words I just said, I'd like to start us off somewhere a little more familiar. Most of us have experienced conflict in our jobs regardless of what our profession is. You might have been in a meeting where two groups have disagreed about priorities. You've seen projects stall because one team promised something another team member couldn't deliver, or you've worked under a supervisor whose expectations conflicted with realistic outcomes. You may have even watched partnerships fall apart because something that seemed initially minor turned into a major misunderstanding. None of these situations are unusual. In fact, they're quite predictable. Because conflict in business is not accidental, it's structural. Markets are built on competition, organizations are built on hierarchy, firms operate under constraints, and stakeholders hold different priorities. When you combine these complex factors, performance pressures, and even power struggles, conflict is not just a possibility, it's inevitable. And despite this, most business education focuses on things like strategy, finance, and operations, while treating conflict as a disruption rather than as a core management function. But unmanaged conflict is expensive. It drains productivity, erodes trust, increases turnover, and externally it can turn into litigation. And whether internal or external, it definitely reshapes an organizational culture, often in ways that leaders do not intend. So the issue is not whether conflict will arise, the issue is how it will arise, how it's managed, and how it will be resolved. Today, we're examining conflict management in business across two levels, external conflict and internal conflict. We'll begin with external conflict, disputes between organizations, commercial partners, vendors, and stakeholders, and consider why mediation emerged as the strategic alternative to litigation. Then we'll move into internal conflict, disputes within organizations, across teams and roles, and explore how mediation functions differently inside of the firm. From there, we'll examine the layers of workplace conflict, looking at how organizational conflict culture shapes outcomes in the workplace. Then finally, we'll consider mediation as a leadership skill and what it means for managers to intervene in conflict rather than avoid or dominate it. We'll be discussing the implications of neutrality, when leadership involvement supports resolution, and when it risks deteriorating the process. This presentation is not just about mediation as a technical legal tool, but also about how mediation is also a management choice that shapes organizational culture. External conflict is not inherently negative. It's a structural feature of markets. Some forms of conflict actually drive performance, like competitive rivalries that push organizations to innovate, differentiate, and improve efficiency. In that sense, conflict can be productive, but conflict can also become destructive. Disputes over contracts, intellectual property, licensing agreements, or partnership breakdowns can stall those same benefits and damage reputations. And most of us, even outside of corporate settings, have seen versions of this dynamic. Conflict often doesn't begin as a catastrophe, but it begins as a simple difference of opinion or perspective. Historically, these kinds of external disputes were handled through litigation. The courtroom was the default mechanism for resolving commercial conflict. For decades, organizations relied on litigation as the dominant response. But here's where the structure matters. Litigation is adversarial by design because it frames disputes as win-lose situations. It's expensive, time-consuming, and most importantly, it is public. Discovery alone can consume a significant portion of total legal costs, particularly in complex commercial cases. But beyond cost, think about what the process does to the relationship. Imagine there's two organizations in a long-term supply agreement. For years, their contract works just fine. Then, as market conditions shift, a pricing clause is interpreted differently. Suddenly, emails become tense, calls become formal, and eventually somebody files suit. Now what changes? Lawyers begin speaking for people that once worked well together, internal documents and policies are preserved and reviewed, and executives drain resources to prepare for dispositions. Communication narrows, trust freezes, and even if the case settles, and statistically it will, the relationship rarely is able to return to its original form. Because litigation doesn't just resolve conflict, it restructures it. For federal civil cases, approximately 92% are resolved before trial, according to Federal Judicial Center data. So organizations can spend heavily on litigation only to end up back into a negotiated agreement anyway. And when we say litigation is costly, we often mean financial cost, but there are hidden costs that are often more significant. Things like executive attention diverted away from strategy, employees being pulled into document production instead of innovation, and public filings that affect reputations. Industry partners were watching how disputes were handled. Litigation consumes not only capital, but focus, resources, and trust. So over time, businesses began to recognize that adversarial systems were often misaligned with how they actually want to operate. Because most disputes do not happen between strangers. They happen between parties who exist in the same market and who may need to continue interacting after the dispute ends. The question was not whether litigation worked, but whether the processes produced the kind of outcomes organizations really needed. And that recognition became a major driver in the 1990s for the expansion of alternative dispute resolution, or ADR, which refers to the processes of used to resolve disputes outside of formal judicial proceedings. Those include things like negotiation, arbitration, and mediation. And more importantly, ADR represents a design of process. The core premise is that commercial conflict can be resolved more efficiently, more flexibly, and with greater control than through traditional litigation. And that shift sets the stage for why mediation has become the predominant choice in resolving conflict externally. As ADR expanded in the 1990s, a range of dispute resolution mechanisms emerged, but mediation quickly distinguished itself and ultimately became the dominant approach for commercial disputes. As businesses searched for processes that were faster, less costly, and less adversarial than traditional court proceedings, a deeper shift was integral. Litigation asks who wins, where mediation asks how do we solve this and preserve value. That difference reflects a fundamentally different orientation towards resolving conflict. You might be asking, what made mediation stand out amongst the processes, and what continues to sustain its dominance? To put it simply, mediation protects both business interests and business relationships simultaneously. And we can see that shift in the structural advantages that mediation offers. The first is cost. Litigation is resource intensive, financially and operationally. Mediation drastically reduces legal spend and managerial time diverted from core operations. Later commentary frames ADR not as an emergency response, but as an embedded strategic option because of this efficiency. Neutral expertise. Instead of a judge who is unfamiliar with business context handling the outcome, mediation allows a trained neutral party to facilitate resolution while the parties retain decision authority. Judges in 2024 emphasize that this neutral space allows parties to disclose true settlement positions without fear of strategic disadvantage. Flexibility. Litigation produces binary outcomes like win and lose, where mediation allows creative and business-driven solutions. Confidentiality. Court proceedings are public and mediation is private. For businesses concerned about trade secrets, reputational damage, or other risks, confidentiality is not just a luxury but a strategic protection. Party representation. Unlike litigation, where the structure is rigid and lawyer-driven, mediation allows businesses to determine who participates and how. This preserves voice and autonomy. And last, amicability. Perhaps most importantly, mediation shifts the frame from adversarial combat to collaborative problem solving. Mediation fosters mutually beneficial agreements. But mediation did not become and remain dominant simply because it was cheaper. It became dominant because it aligned with how businesses actually operate, through ongoing relationships, negotiated agreements, strategic compromise, and long-term value preservation. Businesses recognize something fundamental. Most commercial disputes do not occur between strangers. They occur between partners, suppliers, and competitors whose relationship does not end when this dispute ends. Litigation often severs relationships where mediation preserves them, and that realization reframed conflict as a management issue, not just a legal one. Because if conflict can be both productive and destructive in the marketplace, the same is true inside of organizations. So what changed is not the existence of conflict, but how it is managed. Just as external conflict can be productive or destructive, the same is true inside organizations. For example, constructive disagreement improves decision quality, challenges assumptions, exposes blind spots, strengthens innovation, and improves organizational learning. In healthy organizations, some degree of tension is not just tolerated, but is necessary. But conflict does not remain neutral when it's unmanaged. It escalates. And that's the kind of conflict most of us are more familiar with. Before we go further, I'd like you to think of a specific conflict you've experienced in an organization. Here's some examples that it could be. A disagreement between colleagues, a conflict involving leadership, a time that there was a team breakdown, or a conflict that escalated. Or if you want to go a little further, maybe you could think of one that wasn't handled very well. We're going to use that as an example for the rest of this section and as a reflective activity. What begins as a subtle frustration can become open disagreement. Open disagreement can harden into personal conflict. Once it gets personal, the issue is no longer just about a task or the job, it's about identity, respect, and belonging. And over time, the ways conflict is handled in an organization becomes embedded in culture. Organizations develop predictable patterns in how conflict is handled. Those patterns become the conflict culture. Research has identified 3 dominant types. There's a collaborative culture, which treats conflict as information, disagreements are surfaced early, dialogue is encouraged, and leaders model curiosity rather than defensiveness. Conflict here is often channeled into problem solving. There's a dominating culture, which treats conflict as competition, where winning matters, authority settles disputes, power dynamics are explicit or quietly enforced. Conflict here escalates quickly because it's framed as victory or loss. Finally, there's an avoidant culture, which treats conflict as a threat. Disagreements are minimalized, issues are deferred, silence is interpreted as harmony, but suppressed conflict rarely disappears. It kind of resurfaces later with more intensity. Now, these cultures do not emerge by accident. They are reinforced by leadership behavior. What leaders reward, tolerate, escalate, and what they ignore. Those are all indicators of the company culture. So, think back to the conflict you identified earlier. What was the primary culture in that moment? Was disagreement welcomed or shut down? Was it weaponized or avoided? And what did leadership model? Understanding conflict culture is only the first layer. The deeper leadership question is this: what kind of dispute system is being designed? Because culture is reinforced structurally through policies, reporting channels, incentives, and innovation practices. When conflict escalates, managers are typically expected to step in, not necessarily because they're trained as mediators, but because they hold authority and are responsible for employee outcomes. So, internal conflict management also often defaults to leadership. But stabilizing conflict while maintaining things like productivity, enforcing standards, or protecting business interests creates weird pressure that shapes how conflict is handled. Effective systems must balance three elements: efficiency, which looks like protecting time, productivity, and organizational resources. Conflict cannot consume unlimited energy, but when efficiency dominates, dissent may be silenced. Equity, which is fairness both in process and outcomes, which looks at how the process, if the process was transparent, if standards were applied consistently, and if it feels just. Without fairness, conflict doesn't disappear, it just lingers. And voice, meaningful participation. Did the individuals in conflict feel heard? Was it psychologically safe to speak? Without voice, resolution may look complete but feel coercive. These elements are often in tension, and leadership is not choosing one. They're managing trade-offs. And how these trade-offs are managed helps identify what kind of conflict culture the organization is navigating. Now apply these same factors back to your example. Did you initially identify the culture correctly? And is it consistent across the organization, or was it situational? Now that we're thinking about mediation as a management tool, we need to ask a more precise question. What kind of conflict are managers actually stepping into? Because workplace conflict isn't just personality differences. It operates across layers. And if we misdiagnose the layer, we mismanage the conflict. So returning again to the conflict you've been holding in mind. What kind of conflict was it really? At first glance, many workplace disputes look interpersonal. Different communication styles, emotional reactions, or clashing personalities. These are the most visible conflicts and ones that managers are most often asked to fix. But sometimes what looks interpersonal is actually structural. Things like unclear roles, competing incentives, workload imbalances, and ambiguity across authority lines. In those cases, no amount of mediation between individuals will resolve the tension because the conflict is embedded in the system. Other times, the conflict is cultural. Norms around hierarchy, expectations about feedback, and assumptions about inclusion and belonging. These kinds of conflicts are less about the immediate disagreement and more about the environment in which it occurs. And then there are political conflicts, which involve power, influence, status, and access to resources. And this is where things become especially complex, because power is rarely neutral. Now think back again. What type of conflict was yours really? Often it is more than one. So let's pause and bring this together. You've been holding a specific conflict in mind, and you've considered the kind of culture that surrounds it, how efficiency, equity, and voice were balanced, and what layer of contact was actually present. Now, you can ask yourself one more question. What skill would have improved that situation? Probably not more authority, probably not a stricter policy, but a skill. Because mediation internally is not just a formal process, but a set of tested competencies. The ability of a manager to diagnose the type of conflict, separate tasks from identities, and surface underlying interests of employees involved in conflict creates a space for conflict resolution that's balancing voice without losing structure, balancing fairness with forward momentum, and relationship rebuilding. When mediation is treated as a skill rather than as a last resort in times of intense conflict, it changes how managers show up for their employees. They stop reacting to escalation and begin shaping it earlier. And that shifts conflict from something to suppress into something to actually channel. So now let's return to your example. If someone in that situation had strong mediation skills, would the escalation have slowed? Would voice have increased? Would the outcome have felt more just? Often when conflict feels mishandled, what's missing is not good intention, it's mediation competence. Great, so now that we've framed mediation as a management competency, does that mean that leaders should always be the ones mediating workplace conflict? Not necessarily. Up to this point, we've treated mediation as a leadership skill, but leadership and neutrality are not always the same thing. In most organizational conflicts, leaders hold formal authority. They influence performance evaluations, compensation, promotions, access to opportunity, and even your job security. That creates a power imbalance, and power changes disclosure. When a manager attempts to mediate a conflict involving someone they supervise, employees may hesitate to fully disclose concerns. Even if the leaders intend to be fair, the perception of bias can undermine psychological safety. And we've already established that voice is central to effective conflict systems. So if voice is suppressed because of power dynamics, mediation loses its integrity. There's another risk as well. Leader-mediated conflict can quietly shift from facilitative to evaluative, from dialogue to decision-making, from mediation to managerial adjustments. And at that point, the process may restore efficiency, but sacrifices equity and voice. So the real question becomes, when should leadership step in, and when should leadership step aside? Many organizations address this tension through layered dispute resolution systems. They don't rely on one single actor. Instead, they build options. Things like internal HR professionals trained in mediation, external programs that provide confidential and neutral support, and even trained mediators when power imbalances or organizational risk are significant. Tiered systems that escalate disputes progressively depending on severity. Those are just some examples, but research suggests that mediation is highly effective in individual level disputes, and the more complex or collective conflicts often require additional structural safeguards. The goal is not to remove leadership from conflict, it's to recognize where neutrality is necessary to perfect the efficiency, equity, and voice. So mediation inside of organizations is not just about resolving disputes quickly, it's about designing conflict systems that preserve trust, legitimacy, and organizational health. We're going to end with a short diagnostic exercise. Throughout this presentation, I've asked you to hold a specific conflict in mind, something you've experienced inside of your role in an organization. Now we're going to evaluate it a little more systematically. You don't need to share it, this is just for you, but take a moment and picture that conflict clearly. Who is involved? What was the tension about? How was it handled? I'm going to walk you through a few short questions. As you listen, mentally rate each item from 1 to 5, where 1 means not true at all and 5 means strongly true. Take your time thinking about each one. First is about conflict culture. So first think about the environment. Was the disagreement surfaced openly, early, or did it build quietly before becoming invisible? Did leadership model curiosity or defensiveness? Would you describe the culture in that moment as collaborative, dominating, or avoidant? Part 2 is evaluating efficiency, equity, and voice. Now consider how the conflict was managed. Was the process efficient without feeling rushed? Did it feel fair? Were standards applied consistently? Most importantly, did the people involved genuinely feel heard? Not just allowed to speak, but heard. Next, to think about the type of conflict. Was it interpersonal, or was it structural and rooted in unclear roles or competing incentives? Was it cultural, about norms or identity, or was it tied to political, with power imbalances or access to resources? Did leadership address the root cause or just the visible symptoms? Finally, did the person intervening demonstrate mediation skill? Did they listen carefully, reframe tension constructively, balance participation, protect voice while maintaining structure, or any of the other skills along the mediation process? And ask yourself honestly, would a neutral third party have improved the outcome? Would more mediation skills have improved the outcome? Now step back and look at your mental scores. Where was the system the strongest, and where did it break down? Often conflict doesn't fail because of bad intentions. It fails because efficiency overrides voice in organizational settings. Fairness is procedural but not relational. Power dynamics suppress disclosure, or leaders are asked to mediate without mediation training. And this is the core takeaway. Mediation inside organizations is not just a technique, but a systemic competency that requires skill and structural design. And sometimes it requires neutrality that leadership cannot provide alone. So as you leave this presentation, consider this. If you were redesigning that organization's conflict system today, what would you change? Would you train leaders differently? Clarify escalation pathways? Formalize a mediation training? How far would you go to acknowledge and proactively respond to mediation needs and conflict in your organization? Conflict is inevitable, but escalation is not. The difference lies in how deliberately conflict systems are designed. Today we began by looking at conflict in the marketplace. External conflict can be productive or destructive. For decades, litigation served as the dominant response, but it proved costly, adversarial, and often misaligned with the realities of modern organizations. Mediation rose not simply because it was cheaper, but because it aligned with how institutions actually function, through ongoing relationships, negotiated compromises, and long-term value preservation. Then we turned inward. Internal conflict is not just inevitable, it can strengthen decision-making, or it can escalate into psychological strain, disengagement, high turnover, and cultural erosion. And how conflict is handled does not disappear after resolution, it becomes embedded in the culture, shapes what people believe is safe to say, and honestly, whether dissent is productive or dangerous. It shapes trust. And that makes mediation more than a dispute resolution tool. It becomes a part of the organization's conflict architecture, how it gets resolved. We've seen that the effective systems must balance efficiency, equity, and voice, and we've seen that conflict operates across layers: interpersonal, structural, cultural, political. We've seen that leadership intervention carries both power and risk, including a reflection on our own experiences. So the question is not whether leaders should manage conflict. They must. The question is whether they recognize when mediation is required, when neutrality is necessary, and when their own authority complicates the process. Ultimately, mediation inside of an organization is not about avoiding lawsuits. It's about protecting efficiency so conflict doesn't consume the organization, equity so processes remain legitimate, and voice so that people feel safe to engage. And finally, organizational health so relationships endure beyond disagreement. Mediation is not just a legal strategy, but it's a structural decision. Conflict is inevitable, but escalation is not, and the difference lies in whether mediation is treated as a last resource or as a core organizational competency.